When last week Matt Goodwin announced new research that found white Britons will become a minority in their own country by 2063, there was, to an extent, a rubbing of hands with glee by people who have nothing but dripping ethnic contempt for the host majority population in this country, but the broader attitude was, well, how does this affect you personally? Or why do you care so much? And this was best summed up back in 2021 by this exchange between Nigel Farage and Sajid Javid, when the census data revealed that Britain's largest cities, including its capital London, was minority English. Nigel Farage reacted with alarm, recording a video in the back of a taxi saying that Britain becoming minority white was an alarming inevitability. And Sajid Javid, who is a permanent fixture of the Conservative cabinet, he was at one point Chancellor of the Exchequer, Home Secretary, and Health Secretary, he responded, "So what?" with complete apathy about the wholesale substitution of the host majority and their culture in their own home. And this was best then summed up with this new data that 2063 is the deadline of when white Britons will subside from the host majority to a minority which I don't anticipate being treated as well with protected status as current minorities in the country. This was reacted to by the likes of Anand Menon in The Independent with the question of, who cares that Britain is on course to become minority white? That would be the white British themselves, Anand. They care. Because at the moment, minorities, ethnic and religious, have protected status over them at their expense, legally and in the forms of taxes, in their country. So there's a kind of Ottoman millet system being enforced upon the host majority when they voted against it at every opportunity and been ignored anyway. And so, if we're being mistreated now while we're the majority, there is a concern that we'll be even further mistreated when we are minorities in our own country. And it's also just a matter of principle of, we don't want this to happen, but it's happening to us anyway, and this is an unprecedented thing for the settled indigenous host population to, by means of policy, become no longer the dominant home-owning force and instead be outnumbered by its house guests. So I, quote, tweeted this with, "Yes, your culture is being driven to extinction by a mass immigration experiment that you voted against at every opportunity. Yes, your demographic displacement is justified as punishment for historical wrongs by those holding ethnic grudges. But why do you care so much?" And I think that second sentence is an important point because we're constantly told that diversity is our strength and that diversity just is code for non-white, meaning that white people are weak, according to the likes of Sadiq Khan and even the Conservatives who would stand at the dispatch box and say this slur against the people. But also, there's a kind of Mott and Bailey with immigration arguments, because it is touted as the sole strength of the nation, and it would be nothing without it. But also, when you complain about it and you notice the deleterious consequences of demographic and thereby cultural change, you are told, well, you deserve it for having emigrated to and colonized other people, never mind the fact that you brought them working plumbing and the wheel and abolished slavery, and instead they bring you Deliveroo drivers, sexual assault, and higher taxes. Not exactly the best quid pro quo in the world, but anyway, so let's look at Anand's piece, because what a lot of this debate boils down to is ethnic minorities who do not have a reverence for the people and the culture of the country that they're living in, but instead regard them with a kind of hostility or suspicion, trying to define themselves into the host majority identity by reconfiguring what the identity means when the host majority don't want their identity redefined. So Anand says, one newspaper report explained, rather curiously, that white British is defined as people who do not have an immigrant parent. Bad luck then, all of you non-white kids of an Irish, French, or German parent. Bear in mind, the Irish are indigenous to the British Isles. The French and the Germans have a qualitative cultural difference from the millions of third world migrants who arrived after the Boris wave. So I think we can draw distinctions between types of immigrants. They're not just all in the box of immigrant. And Anand is building this straw man here to insist that everyone is in the same category as immigrant. And if you object to, a million Indians coming over in 4 years, you're also objecting to the Hungarian waitress who's coming over to work for a year on the Erasmus scheme and go back once her university degree is done. No, we can kind of draw distinctions between those types of people. The latter is a question of quantity and economic sustainability. The former is a question of quality and cultural proximity. And what is being done is building the straw man so that if you object to the former, the million Indians, then you must also object to the latter. And that's absurd. And so if you just hate immigrants, then the only position that is left is you must want unlimited numbers of immigrants, and you can't draw distinctions between people that are more or less likely to assimilate or at least appreciate our culture and want to live according to our custom. So therefore, if you can't draw any qualitative distinction, then your identity can be laid claim to by anyone who happens to pick it up and want to wear it like a skin suit. And he says, beyond this rank stupidity, there is of course something else going on here. This is less a dog whistle than plain old whistle. Dodgy extrapolations posing as predictions. And then, of course, we have the equating of foreign-born and Muslim populations, implying presumably that if you're Muslim, you just don't cut it wherever you happen to have been born. No. You are Muslim if you're in a Muslim country. If you are a Muslim, you are not British. I mean, that's going to be uncomfortable for many people to say, but we are an explicitly Christian country. We also have opposition to cousin marriage practices, which are seemingly part and parcel, as Sadiq Khan would say, of the Muslim world. And so that means that your lineage, your religion, your culture, and your heritage does influence whether or not you belong to one tribe or the other. And the tribe of the British is mutually exclusive from the tribe of Islam, the Ummah, who regard themselves as a kind of ethnic and religious collective as well. So yes, they are mutually exclusive. It doesn't matter whether or not that makes you uncomfortable. That is a fact, and you do not get to redefine my national identity, which I have inherited as a matter of gratitude from people who have made sacrifices to build my culture and my country and impart onto me the obligation to sustain all of these achievements. You don't get to redefine that out of existence just to make you feel included or to make millions of people who have nothing but contempt for those traditions and those religious beliefs feel included too. I am very happy with my identity being exclusive from yours. It does not survive if it is not. And then he says, if the problem that this country simply isn't white enough, someone may as well just come out and say it, because clearly the issue here isn't Britishness. No, it is. And the British happen to be Caucasian. They happen to be pale-skinned. They happen to be Northwest European. Some people who are British, as in ethnically British, are half ethnically British and half of somewhere else, like Ben Habib or Calvin Robinson, and they are, of course, partially indigenous to these isles. And so that has no moral quality. Their skin colour has absolutely no weight on whether or not they are a good person. So to set up this straw man that it's just about skin colour, to try and reduce it down to the most gauche and objectionable bigotry that then forces people who disagree with your character of national identity to agree with you so that they aren't just called racist because they also agree that racism is a bad thing. That's one of the most disingenuous sleights of hand that is routinely played, and it is played so that people are disarmed in their ability to argue against you redefining their national identity. Sorry, no, I don't think that skin colour is a sum total of a person, and it's because I think that I think that Britishness cannot be boiled down to white, yes, but that to be British is a matter of lineage. And so you also do not get to define yourself into being British by also emptying out Britishness of any content, of any culture. And so I think this is a wholly disingenuous and awful article. And he says there is a serious debate to be had, not only about immigration, but also about integration. Happily, the country that most of us inhabit is a place where both ethnic and religious integration is a daily reality for millions of families, including my own. But that just simply isn't the case. Like, assimilation and integration, the standard for integration is usually abide by the law and pay your taxes. That does not make you my neighbour, my countryman, my kinsman. You are not indistinguishable from the host population, but you are arguing that you should be indistinguishable from the host population while you are distinguishing yourself as an immigrant family with a different faith than that of the state. I mean, a citizen in the ancient world meant he who had the religion of the state, because states were formed around families who worshipped the same ancestors, made the same sacrifices, and that scaled upwards into the gods of the city-state with their own myths, like Romulus and Remus, or Minerva, the goddess of Bath in the Roman settlement of Bath in Britain. And so all of the people worshipped the same gods, whether or not they were through lineage or whether or not they were through sort of archetypes of shared heroic values, like the Greco-Roman gods. And so you all had to worship the same god, you would bury your ancestors in the same soil, you would take the soil from the old city-state and plant it in the new one to establish continuity in order to have the same identity. And an idiot, the etymology of the term, was someone who did not have the religion of the state, is a stateless person. So, to say that you don't have to have the religion of the state, you don't have to share the values of the state, and you don't have to have a family connection to the land, is to render, functionally, the actual British people stateless by putting yourself on equal footing and legally privileged above those people. So this is an ultimately an insidious argument to say, well, yes, demographic change and thereby cultural change is going to render you a stranger in your own home, but why do you care? And if you care, you're basically just a racist. And Fraser Nelson makes the same argument in the Times. Fraser Nelson, the most incorrect man in Britain. Of course, on the back of this Matt Goodwin data and Zia Yusuf's temporary departure, he says that Nigel Farage flirts with race politics at his peril. And so Fraser Nelson is trying to enforce this civic nationalism straw man that just being born in Britain or having a piece of paper makes you as indistinguishably British as someone who can trace their ancestral lineage back generations. He is trying to force that on Nigel Farage and everyone else that needs to be an adult in the room, else you are an ethnic nationalist or a racial purist. So they create this false dichotomy where if you don't believe in Fraser Nelson's boilerplate, bland version of British values, you are a racial determinist who must hate all black people and wants absolutely none of them to live in Britain. That is such a disingenuous smear, but it is the way that the dialectic is advanced, and you can see it in this article. He says, its recent anti-Muslim tone as a sign reform could slide into an unpalatable nativism that its leader can't control. Focusing on Zia Yusuf, you don't grow up as a British Muslim without recognising the dog whistles, the manufactured rows, the slow drift from cultural concern into civilizational paranoia. The technique is well worn on the continent to stir up a fight, any fight, and frame it as Muslims versus the West. That is how a lot of Muslims think about it. I think Fraser Nelson doesn't understand, or is voluntarily trying not to understand, the theory of mind from a parallel civilization who see themselves as spreading a religion by either the word or the sword, and through demographic means as well. We don't think of ourselves in that way, as sort of individualistically minded, functionally secular, even if we're practicing Catholics, like Fraser claims to be, and that I am. We don't see ourselves that way as Brits, but lots of foreign peoples do, and so if you import those foreign peoples, they don't take on the character of Brits. They instead import their indigestible tribal priors to our shores, and it results in ethnic and cultural fracturing and the hijacking of an individualistic democracy by sectarian concerns, particularly among Muslims. He writes, hard conversations about integration and culture are certainly needed, and by that he means a centrally planned integration strategy that has everyone sign up to the values of Tony Blair and David Cameron, which is the British values of tolerance, liberalism, fair play. It's essentially like one big national game of cricket. Well, it turns out India and Pakistan quite like cricket too, but they don't exactly share the values of Britain, or they're not British. He says, this can be done in two ways. One that seeks to promote cohesion, or clash of civilization hysteria where individual crimes are turned into national metaphors. Britain has always stayed on the same side of this divide, the nativists seen as cranks. See the dichotomy here? You're a nativist racist, or you want to liquidate your entire national culture to encompass literally anyone who arrived here yesterday as being indistinguishable from you. It's a false dichotomy, don't buy into it. He says, but this is changing in an era where social media amplifies extremes. Research shows that in Europe, the biggest source of support for new right parties comes from those who see Islam as a threat to their countries. It's almost like that's in direct correlation with the number of Muslim migrants that have entered in the last few years that people have an immediate experience of having to live with and live around, and the fact that all of these terror attacks are happening, and I wonder if we can gain some insight from the fact that they're all shouting Allahu Akbar when they do it. The idea that Fraser Nelson is more of a scholar on what is and isn't authentic Islam, and what these people think, more than the people themselves that are very open about their motivations, is a dangerous delusion that is literally costing lives across the continent and in our country. So it must be rejected. Fraser says, Farage used to cry freedom, saying he had no interest in faith or skin colour. But this week a report was published by Matt Goodwin, an academic and prominent reform supporter, devoted to skin colour and suggesting that white Britons will be the minority by 2063. The foreign-born and their descendants will become a majority in England in 2079, he writes. My own children, Fraser writes, would fail this Brit test due to their mum's Slavic blood. It is important to note that Fraser Nelson has tweeted before that his own children do not identify as white British. So by his own standard, his own children do not believe in it. So if he thinks that second generation assimilation is just a thing of birthplace, values, cultural osmosis, and signing up like a Scout's pledge to British values, then his own children have failed that test. So I suggest Fraser reassesses. I doubt he will. He says the category of mixed race does not appear in his study. It's white Brit, white other, and non-white. Such studies designed for social media are new and significant. Yes, and it's because not every immigrant is Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Not every second generation mixed race heritage person is Ben Habib. Cultural change is usually preceded by demographic change because a culture is preceded by the prefix of the people it belongs to. You cannot have British values or British culture without a distinct British people from whom it comes and from whom, therefore, it belongs. And so if you're a member of the British people, you're more likely to adopt British culture because it is transmitted to you by your parents who believes it is their property and their duty to sustain, but also you are more likely to identify with it because you are more likely to identify as British. And so if you break the chain of cultural inheritance by breaking the chain of direct lineage of parentage of, unfortunately, even though it has no moral weight, ethnicity, then you are going to break the culture. And it is a matter of generations for newcomers to assimilate into the tribe. And it's usually done by marriage, by family, but also education and rites of passage. And especially in a climate where we encourage imported tribal diasporas to indulge in their parallel religions and cultures in the name of multiculturalism, in the name of diversity being a strength, which Fraser Nelson himself supports. In that age, assimilation is impossible because they don't live around the native population. The native population can't even be defined according to Fraser Nelson's definition of Britishness. And if you can't define the people to whom the culture belongs, what are newcomers going to assimilate into? None of these are addressed, and so Fraser Nelson is not providing a viable solution. He's instead redefining our national identity beyond recognition and then calling you a racist when you have some substantive critiques of it. And then he says, and this is basically an extortion racket against Nigel Farage, as was the Westminster debut of Sarah Pochin, Reform's newest MP, it is time she asked Keir Starmer to ban... Is it time to ask Keir Starmer to ban the burqa? Hear, hear, said our colleague Lee Anderson. Another classic wedge issue at the heart of British identity. Are we the sort of country that bans people from wearing things? No, we're the sort of country that doesn't treat women as perennial temptresses for the most violent sex offenders in the Muslim world. We don't blame women for their sexual violence. We have completely different morality from that, Fraser, rooted in Christianity, but also rooted in Germanic law, as Tacitus documented. So yes, that is our cultural and religious tradition, wholly incompatible from Islam, and yes, we should ban it. But instead, he just goes straight for the BNP, a genuinely neo-fascist party, correct, want a burqa ban. Reform, a party of individual freedom, does not. Well, that's not correct. Lots of the Reform MPs now do. They want to ban it for public safety, which is a sort of nebulous reason, but yes, they do. And so the people who are concerned about the increased presence of people wearing burqas, and therefore the values, the deeply held beliefs that are incompatible with their own, that those people wearing the burqa are communicating to them, and object to the treatment of women this way, that is more prevalent, and they are not just members of the BNP, Fraser. It's a disingenuous smear. And so I thought the best person that had a take on this in response to the outrage that Goodwin's stats elicited was actually Tim Stanley in The Telegraph. And he had a very reasonable rejoinder to the antibodies of identity liquidating liberalism that were elicited by Matt Goodwin's stats. And he writes, by 2063, say the sociable hets, the white Britons will be a minority. Come the new century, almost 1 in 5 citizens will be a Muslim. This forces us to consider a very politically incorrect question. Will Britain still be Britain if it's no longer majority white British? The official answer is absolutely yes. Elite liberals believe nations are defined by values, and thus anyone from anywhere in the world can become British if they conform to ours. So it just means the entire world is just British in waiting. It helps that these values are universal. Fairness, tolerance, kindness. This is a portable identity that is uncontroversial because it demands nothing except to pay one's taxes and avoid murder. And it doesn't realise the number of preconceived givens that those beliefs and behaviours rest upon. Keir Starmer warns that we're becoming a nation of strangers, or an island of strangers, while promoting a vision of citizenship that is entirely passive. It's also based on a misreading of human nature. Liberals assume that values shape culture, that such that we could pass a law banning the burqa, banning Islamophobia, and we become good neighbours overnight. But it's the other way around. Culture shapes values, and culture is the product of non-abstract, substantial qualities, such as climate, geography, religion, language, and ethnicity. We can shorthand as history. Thus, we are democratic in Britain not because a committee decided it over one wild weekend, but following nearly 1,000 years of revolution and reaction, baked into a memory and expressed as a temperament. Such a society is light touch and self-governing, at least in theory, because we've been marinating in its ethics and customs since birth. And so, if you diversify the population and you try to redefine British as something that people can pick up and discard whenever it suits them, you import people that are wholly unsuitable to live according to the high-trust, self-governing culture that Britain has enjoyed and has been a source of its peace and prosperity for centuries. And instead, in direct proportion to the increased levels of ethnic diversity and therefore cultural fragmentation, you grow the size of the state. The state picks and plays favourites with its wards. It passes hate speech legislation aimed at the great levelling of all groups to absolute equality, which is why it subsidises them with social housing and benefits, one of the things that Fraser Nelson complains about most, but wants to continue importing people of working age, even if they're not taxpayers and not working. And so you grow the state to become some sort of leviathan that intervenes in every interaction to ensure that equality takes place, premised on the belief that everyone is a blank slate and can therefore become British. And British just comes to mean the realization of everyone's latent egalitarian nature until Britain is just one of many economic zones that anyone from everywhere can inhabit so long as it suits them. But that's just not the case. All of these values, these practices, these habits are particular to a people in a place and a time, and they arose through decades of tradition and trial and error until it became second nature to us, to the point where Fraser Nelson thinks they're so self-evident, why doesn't anyone who passes through the passport gates of Heathrow or Gatwick just instantly conform? That's not the case. Liberalism, in this sense, is unilateral disarmament to virulent, tribal, and incompatible cultures rising up in our midst. And it is time to reject the false binary of civic versus ethno-nationalism, which is pigeonholing sensible critics of the British values rendition of British identity as unconscionable racists, when that just simply isn't the case.